Kathy Swayze is an expert when it comes to helping nonprofits raise money to fund the good work they do. In the last 25 years, she has helped more than 200 organizations raise well over $1 billion. Kathy is the president and creative director of Impact Communications, Inc., and has earned the Certified Fundraising Executive designation. She is a past president of the Washington, D.C. chapter of the Association of Fundraising Professionals and was named Washington, D.C.'s 2012 Outstanding Professional Fundraiser. We are honored to have Kathy with us here today to share her insights into how legal aid organizations can use stories to raise more money and help more people. Please help me welcome Kathy Swayze.
Thank you, Meredith. Thank you, Pat. That was great. And thank you, Jack, for all your years. Mary Lee Bleck was a woman that I'll never forget for as long as I live. This is the story she told me in 2002. My son, Matt, was a very special young man. A wrestling champion in high school, gifted academically, a talented violinist. In 1994, he would have entered his senior year of college, majoring in physics and math. But Matthew never made it to his senior year. He was gunned down that summer by 3 teenagers with a Saturday night special. It was the second shooting that night with the same gun. The call came at 3 a.m. The police officer said, Matthew was a victim of a robbery. He did not resist. He was shot. He is deceased. And she said to me, 10 years later, nearly 10 years later, there is still not one day that I don't want him to walk through the front door, to sit down at the dinner table with his father and me and his brothers and sisters and talk about our days, that I don't want to give him a hug. But most importantly, there's not one day that I don't think about what can I do to prevent this from happening to anyone else's son or daughter. So you can see why I believe in storytelling, because of stories like that. Mary Lee Bleck I've not been in touch with her in many years, but she's in my heart all the time. Every time there's another shooting that we hear about on the news, I think of her, and I gain strength knowing that she's still out there fighting for someone else's child. She, at the time that I met her, was working with the Brady Campaign to Prevent Gun Violence and the Million Mom March. By telling her story, she inspired tens of thousands of people to get involved in the movement for sensible gun laws, and she helped raise millions of dollars. This is one example of why stories work in fundraising, because they make us feel something. Stories work because they raise money. Ken Burnett, who's a brilliant fundraiser out of England, if you don't know him, he's written a number of books and he has a great blog. I encourage you to look him up, Ken Burnett. But he says, when it comes to fundraising, stories trump logic, hands down. Because logic makes people applaud, but stories make people, move people to tears, to anger, and to action. And if we're going to raise funds for our organizations, we need to move people to action. Stories also work because they touch our hearts. And I think the story that I just told is a great example. They help us understand our common humanity. They allow us to feel connected to the other people that we share this planet with. And stories also work in our brain. It's not just a heart matter. People always say to me, well, is it about the head or is it about the heart? And I say, actually, it's about both. But the interesting thing, what that brain scientists are now learning, is that stories actually register in a very particular part of our brain called the insular cortex, which is the part of the brain that regulates our interpersonal communications and relationships. So when we hear a story that part of the brain begins to start shifting through our history of experiences and trying to find something similar in our experience that we can relate to. And in this way, we connect with others and see that we are not so different from someone who might have thought we were very different from. So brain science is even telling us that we need to tell stories. Now, especially if we think about how many of you have donors who are on the elderly side? Yeah, most of us. Most donors, many of our donor files are full of people in their 60s, 70s, 80s, and now even 90s. And many of them have waning cognition. Stories are much easier for them to capture, to hold on to, and to understand and to retain than facts. Whoops, sorry, I keep hitting this by accident. And I know that stories work because for 25 years I've been a fundraiser, and I have told stories repeatedly in my work, and I have taught lots and lots of nonprofits how to tell their stories more effectively. And I've had the great privilege to work with some outstanding organizations and to meet some extraordinary people. And one of those people that I met was a worker at a summer meals site in El Dorado, Arkansas. And she told me about this story. In El Dorado, Arkansas, where I live, 6 in 10 of the children qualify for free or reduced school meals. So our community came together to start a summer meals program because we knew that there were a lot of kids that were going hungry in the summer. And so the first year of our summer meals program, a little boy was coming through the line to get his lunch, and I noticed that he was taking lots of ketchup packets and stuffing them in his pocket. So I asked him, I said, you like ketchup? And he looked at me and he seemed kind of afraid. And he said, I hope it's okay, but when we don't have any food at home, my grandma and me use these to make tomato soup. And when I heard that story, I knew there was power in that story. Because in our wealthy nation, ketchup should not be a meal for any child. So we told that story in a fundraising letter for Share Our Strength, No Kid Hungry campaign. And we touched hearts, and we opened people's checkbooks, and we raised money for the cause of ending childhood hunger. And this is what I'm hoping today that I will be able to inspire you to go back and do for your organizations. This is a letter that I wrote for the Epilepsy Foundation of America many, many years ago. And I'm going to read just the portion that's in red to you. When he was 7 years old, Eric's teachers locked him in an empty classroom by himself for hours. He never told his mother about it because he thought he'd been a bad boy. But Eric wasn't a bad boy. He didn't hit other children. He didn't talk back to his teachers. Eric's only crime was being a little boy with epilepsy. So this letter came to be when the organization said to us, our back to school appeal has been weakening over the last few years, not working very well. And we write to people and we tell them about all the great work that we do to educate teachers and principals and school nurses about seizure disorders and why that's so important. And I said, well, let me talk to some parents. Give me a parent who is sending a child back to school. And they introduced me to this mom who told me this story. And what amazed me most about her telling of this story was that she wasn't really angry. I mean, she was a little bit angry, but more she was just inspired to do something about it. Because what she learned, the reason that teacher had locked up her little boy in an empty classroom was that she was afraid of seizures. She didn't know what she would say to the other kids if it happened, and she didn't know how to explain it. Now, obviously, that's kind of lame, and we'll not get into all that. But the point is, it was a perfect story to lead into the work that we needed to do. We needed funds to go out and educate more teachers. And we told this story. We raised double the amount that they had raised the previous year in their back to school appeal by just telling a very powerful story. And then we took this story, and we put it into the direct mail acquisition package for acquiring new donors. And that was also wildly successful. And this letter was used to acquire members to the Epilepsy Foundation as their control acquisition package for 10 years. And it's not because I'm a brilliant fundraising copywriter, although, I'm pretty good at it. It's because this is a great story that is a real story, that is an authentic story that was told to me because I said I need to talk to somebody who's had this experience. And you can all do that in your own organizations. So we've just established that stories work. Stories help you raise more money, and I'm guessing that most of you in this room, your organizations need more money, yes? Okay, so if you need more money, and we know that stories help you raise more money, then why don't legal aid organizations use stories? Anybody want to throw out ideas? I'm sorry? Confidentiality.
The average lawyer is not a great storyteller.
Okay, what a great segue to my next slide. Lawyers are not storytellers. They argue the law. And don't get me wrong, we love them. We need them. They're very important. They do their jobs extremely well. They can tell you about depositions and amicus briefs and hearings scheduled and motions filed. They have all kinds of good information for you. But they rarely talk to you about the human beings behind the story that they're working. I want to take a moment to acknowledge some people who helped me prepare for this session, and I imagine that you're in the room, so if you could wave. We haven't actually met in person. Joshua Zimrochek from Jacksonville Legal Aid. Hi. Lee Richardson from Legal Aid of Arkansas. Is he here? Andrea Kaufman from Minnesota. Hi, Andrea. And Cindy Durham from Legal Aid of Middle Tennessee. Hi, Cindy. These four folks took time out of their busy schedules to talk to me about the work that you do. And Joshua told me specifically that the donors don't want to hear legalese, right? They don't care about the motions filed. They want to hear about the person who didn't lose their home, right? So our challenge then is to close this gap between lawyers not being very good at storytelling, yet they are the keepers of the stories, and us needing to figure out how to get there. So that's one of our first problems that we're going to face. Now, Lee Richardson also said to me, we have this kind of challenge too, because a lot of our funders want hard data about our impacts. They want to know how many orders of protection did we file, and what percentage of the people from those orders of protections did not go back to their abusers, right? So they want the hard data, but they also want to meet the people behind those numbers. So it's our job to figure out how to introduce them to the people. And when we work with clients on annual reports, we understand that you have to put the numbers there. We did the 1,000 orders of protection. The high percentage of those folks are staying out of those unhealthy relationships. But we also put a sidebar of one story of one of those 1,000 people so that that brings it to life for people. So this is an actual excerpt from a legal aid services organization's fundraising letter. And I'm going to read just a bit of it to you. Last year, legal aid attorneys provided free legal assistance to help more than 7,200 low-income people. Those helped included 1,757 victims of domestic violence and 753 families seeking access to safe and affordable housing. Our attorneys work to protect the rights of 1,040 consumers, and so on, and so on, and so on. Anyone feeling moved? No? Do you feel like maybe you need to go get a calculator, do some math? I'm not going to say whose letter this is, because my guess is that it's not all that dissimilar from some others that many of you in this room might have sent. And that's okay to report back. But to put 7 or 8 statistics in 3 sentences is not going to inspire anyone to keep reading your letter. So we're going to talk here today about how to get the statistics in there, but how to blend them with the stories so that you can have real impact. We, of course, are going to lean on facts. We're a lawyer-centered organization. They love facts. But we also can blend that with stories. And Andrea Kaufman raised a great point when I spoke to her, too, about another reason why legal aid organizations don't tell stories. And it's partly that the lawyers don't even know that these stories are exceptional anymore. They've been doing this work day in and day out. They've seen dozens of stories like this. They've almost become routine to them. It's business as usual. And we need to remind them that no, these stories are remarkable, and remind them of the power of these stories, because for them, it's almost become, every day. Anybody have this experience with some of your staff? Yeah. So Andrea hit something here really good. Thank you, Andrea. So this is not business as usual. This is important work, and there are good stories here that we need to tell. Stories raise money. We figured that out. Your organization needs money, yes? Yes, we figured that out. So now we need to go find our stories. And what I want to talk to you in the remainder of this time is tips on how you can do this better within your own organization. So first, in your handouts, on the tab for, I guess, this time, you should have a series of handouts that you can take home with you, and hopefully they'll be useful resources. I'm going to dive into a few of those things here, and there's a lot more in the handouts. How many of you in your organization, when I say you have a great storyteller in your organization, how many of you have somebody come to mind? Okay, not all of you, but a lot of you. My experience has been, in 25 years working with a couple hundred different organizations, is that in most organizations, there are one or two people who are just phenomenal storytellers. Every time you see them at the coffee pot, you leave feeling a little bit more inspired when you go back to your desk. Those people need to become your best friends. You need to love them to death. You need to spend time with them as often as you can. And usually those people are also the busiest people in the place, right? So not always so easy to get time with them, but it's an absolute must that you build a relationship with the storytellers in your organization. Take them to coffee, stop by their office, and don't only go see them when your fundraising letter has to go to the printer tomorrow and you haven't started writing it yet and it's 5 o'clock on Tuesday. It's like, help, I need a story. Because they're going to feel frustrated by that, and you're not going to get what you need. But if you have been working on building a relationship with that person over time, then you're going to have stories already in your bank, okay? Great. What happened here? The second thing is to create a storytelling culture. How many of you in the room here are the executive directors of your organization? Okay, good, a good number. So if you're the executive director, then it's your job to create a culture that values and honors the importance of stories from the very top. And if you're not the executive director, then it's your job to go back and convince your executive director why it's important to have a storytelling culture within your organization. And some of the ways that I recommend to you to do that is to have the director talk about storytelling in meetings and talk about the fact that it's the role of everyone in the organization to be listening to and alert for good stories of our impact, and to share those back with the team of communications, fundraising, marketing professionals who are trying to get funds for the organization. And one of the things I've seen done effectively at some organizations is making storytelling a part of a regular meeting. Not a weekly meeting because it would become burdensome, but maybe a quarterly meeting or a monthly meeting where a different person is assigned each time to bring a story to open the meeting or to close the meeting with. It can become a source of inspiration for the whole staff, as well as a reminder that stories matter and that we need those stories for a lot of different purposes, not just for fundraising. When I spoke with Lee Richardson, who is executive director of his organization and does not have dedicated fundraising staff or marketing staff, he said that his biggest challenge is the lack of time. He knows the stories are out there, just hard to find time to go get them. Anybody else feeling that, right? We all have budgets to manage, board reports to write, foundation grant proposals to meet. So it's very difficult to take the time to go and get the stories. And here's the clue. They're not going to come to you at your desk while you're sitting there writing the board report. They won't come find you. You have to find them. So one of the things I want to talk about is some very simple techniques that you can use to let people speak for themselves and to ask for stories and have them start coming to you. One way is to use your website. This is an example of the Epilepsy Foundation, and they just have a page on there that they've labeled Heroes Among Us. Tell us your story. A little bit easier for a disease charity, perhaps, than for an organization serving poor people, but I raise it as a suggestion. Anyway, to think about, if you have some people who've already been very forthcoming with their stories, would you be willing to share your story on our website and open it up for others to share how they've been helped? That's one way. And social media, Facebook, same, lots of tools. Doesn't have to be just your website. Use your business cards. How many of you have had the experience of you go out to a barbecue or a cocktail party or a baseball game and you meet someone new, a friend of a friend, and they say, oh, what do you do? And you say, blah, 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 I work for legal aid. And they say, oh, great, let me tell you about my sister, or my colleague at work, or my friend who I knew in college, and how they were helped by legal aid. May not even be, right, this has happened to all of you, right? May not even be in your town. It's a legal aid 3 states away that helped this person, but they have a story. They have a legal aid story. A lot of people have legal aid stories that may be 2 or 3 times removed, or maybe very close and personal. So what if everyone in your organization was trained that every time that happened to them, they pulled out their business card and really expressed genuine interest to this person? Thank you so much for sharing your story. Would you please email me that story? We're always eager to hear good stories about the success of legal aid in people's lives and how it's made a difference. Would you mind taking the time to email me that story? And just hand them your business card. So if you've got 30 staff and half of them hand out a business card once a month, and even 2 of those business cards come back in as emails with a story attached to them, you have a flow going of stories. And that then becomes a place where you can call that person back and talk to them in more detail. So what happened here? So, okay. And then the next thing is to interview people. And one of the things I heard over and over again from everyone I talked to is that the lawyers aren't very good at telling the stories. They don't remember the details. They haven't focused on those kind of details. They focused more on the details of the legalese. So again, find the ones who are better at telling personal details, and then think about other people that you can talk to who are the keepers of the story. Are there people who work with the lawyers who have access? Can you get access to the clients directly? And make a commitment to getting up from your desk and going out and doing interviews and talking to people. And in your book, I have provided you with sample interview questions for volunteers, for staff, for clients that I hope will be helpful to you. And I know you'll come up and create your own, and probably some of you in this room have incredible ideas about questions that have worked well for you. But it's really, really important that you talk to people and establish rapport with them and ask them to be willing You have to be willing to get emotional with them in order for them to get emotional with you. So if you go in and say, how did you first learn about legal aid? Great. How did we help you? Great. Those kinds of very factual-based questions are going to get you factual-based answers. So I've given you questions that are about trying to get underneath the feelings that they had when they were helped by you. And I wanted to point out in particular my number one go-to question, which I have used for many years, and it never ceases to amaze me, the good stuff that rolls out after you ask this question, which is, tell me about a memorable moment in your work, a time when you knew you were in exactly the right place, doing exactly the work you were meant to do, perhaps even a time when you got a little choked up. Okay? So I have then created for them an atmosphere of like, think back to a time when you were really moved. Now, one of two things will happen when you ask this question. Very often what will happen is the person will say, oh my goodness, there are just so many. I don't even know where to start. There's so many good stories, so many moments. And they might even get a little teary starting to think about some of them, and that's okay. Tell them it's okay. Comfort them. We have those tools. We don't have to be afraid of that. We have tools where we all understand how to comfort someone, right? So then the stories start coming, and you can probe and ask deeper questions, and if they're telling you about clients, you can ask, would it be okay for me to speak to this client, right? The second thing that might happen, which is not as helpful, is when the person looks at you and says, can I think about that and get back to you? Anybody had that happen before? That is a person who's not a storyteller. That is a person who is not comfortable getting emotional, right? And we all have met them. They're in our organizations. And that's okay, because not everyone is going to be a storyteller. And you don't need to push that person beyond their comfort zone. So you simply say, yeah, great, thanks. I'm sure you have hundreds of stories. Just think about it a little bit and get back to me. And they usually don't, but it's okay. You don't have to push to turn this into something that every single person can do. But I really want to stress the importance of you being comfortable with someone getting emotional. Because if you're not, then they won't. There's energy that happens when two people interact. And you have to create an environment that is welcoming for emotions. One of my favorite fundraising stories of all time is that I had the opportunity to meet and offer some advice to Stephen Bright, who was the president of the Southern Center for Human Rights. And for those of you who don't know, they work representing poor people who are on death row and who don't have money to hire a lawyer. Great, great organization. And he had written a fundraising letter and asked me to take a look at it. It was a very nice letter. Just had one problem. Didn't ask for money. Yeah, tiny little problem. So I said to Stephen, Stephen, this is great, but you didn't ask them to do anything. You just told them what you're doing, but you didn't tell them what you need. You didn't ask them for anything. And Stephen said in his very nice Southern accent, well, I just didn't think it would be polite. Well, and what I said to Stephen that day and what I say to you today, it's not polite for someone to be on death row without a lawyer either. So you have to get over your own stuff and move outside of your box in order to do the work that we all need to do for all the good reasons why we are here doing this work. Interviews lead to great things, and here's another example, which unfortunately looks very faded up there on the screen, but it's okay. Reading is Fundamental, great organization that has distributed books, unfortunately lost some of their federal money, so not as many books happening as there used to be. But I had the chance to talk with a teacher who worked in a program that had a RIF program for many years. And she said, you know, it's amazing how important, people don't really understand how important these books are. And I said, well, tell me more about that. What do you mean? And she said, well, I have a second grade class, and we were focusing on a reading section, and I asked everyone to bring in a book from home, bring one of their favorite books from home. And this one little girl, Alondra, brought a book about football, about a particular college football player. And she wasn't a particularly tomboyish girl, and I thought this was kind of an odd choice for her. I didn't that she would bring in a book about football. So I said to her, why did you pick this book? And she looked at me and she said, this is the only book we have in our house. And it was a book that her brother had gotten from RIF a few years earlier, right? So again, these kinds of stories touch you in a way that you can't imagine in your childhood having only one big book in your home, or in your grandchild or your own children's lives. So this moves you in a way that you can connect to and relate to. So now we've established that stories help us raise money. We all need money. We've talked about some ways to go find your stories, and now we're going to talk about a few elements, 6 elements of a great story, because it's not enough to just go talk to people and come back with some notes and say, okay, I have a story. The story has to have power, and these are some of the ways you can know it's going to be a powerful story. It doesn't tell me what you do, it tells me why you do it. I might be curious about how many lawyers you have and how your departments are structured and what programs you have and what your needs are. I mean, I might be curious, but I'm not going to be particularly moved by you telling me that. But if you tell me why you're doing this work, what would the world look like if you weren't there? How would people's lives be different if you weren't there? Then I get it. We had the opportunity to work with the Washington National Cathedral on a case statement for a Major Gifts initiative. And I interviewed one of their longtime cathedral members, volunteers, who said this to me. When I come to the cathedral, I find out who I am, where I've come from, and why it matters that I am here in this world. No matter how many times I am here, this place inspires me. It was very prominently featured in their case for support. And the reason is that, yes, the cathedral did have damage during the earthquake, and we could talk about that. And yes, we do have a lot of physical plant needs, and we have wonderful programming, evensong services, and the choirs, and the church services, and the national commemorations and funerals. I mean, so many wonderful things that we do there. And that's all good. But what we really want to understand is what happens to people when they walk into this majestic facility. If I can get people to go there when they're thinking about writing a check, it's a whole different kind of conversation. Okay? So that's number 1. Think about how your organization, why your organization is doing the work and why it matters. And literally ask yourself, paint a picture of what it would look like if we weren't here. Number 2, the second element of a powerful story is it focuses on one person. And we've demonstrated that here today already by talking about Mary Lee Black and her son, about the little boy who was stuffing ketchup packages in his pockets, about the little girl who only had one book in her home. It has been proven again and again and again that if millions of people are starving from a famine, you can tell people that and they will be a certain amount moved. But if you tell them about one child who died and didn't make it to their 3rd birthday because of that famine, you're going to raise much more money. So zoom in, stop talking about statistics, and start talking about people and human beings. Yeah. Here's an example from a whole stadium of people. That's kind of an interesting perspective. But what about when you think about the one fan whose team just lost in the playoffs? Then you get a whole different visual of what's going on. So it gives you, I wanted to give you some visual understanding of what we mean by focusing in. And I have another fun story, which is about a turtle. And animals are always fun, so I thought I would share. Because focusing in on one person, it doesn't always actually have to be a person. This is a story for the National Aquarium here in Washington, D.C., and their turtle rescue program. And often what happens if a mama turtle is killed, little baby hatchlings will be on the beach, and if they're left there, they'll just be swooped up by a bird and eaten for lunch, and they don't get a chance to grow up and help their species survive, and many of these turtle species are endangered. So one particular turtle was rescued and brought to the National Aquarium to fatten up and get ready to go back. And they named him Alistair, and Alistair lived at the National Aquarium for many years, and everyone got to know him and love him. And then he got to go back. And in that story, we talked about the whole big experience of why it mattered that Alistair was there. It wouldn't have been interesting if we just said, oh, we have this cute turtle at the aquarium. That's great. But no, the why was this turtle's at the aquarium not just to fatten up, but to change the fate of his species, right? Because if he makes it, she makes it, I think it was a he, when he makes it, and gets released back in, there's a chance. There's a chance. So again, telling stories about powerful things. Number 3 thing that you can do to make your story impactful is to use details. Tell me something that I can feel, that I can see, that I can smell, that I can hear when I read it. Allow me to create a picture in my mind of what is happening here. This is a beautiful photograph, isn't it? Chrysanthemums. It's actually not a photograph, it's a painting. But the painting, the painter used such exquisite detail that it comes across looking like a photograph. And that's exactly what we're trying to do in our stories, is make them so full of detail that as I'm reading it, as I'm hearing it, I can form a picture in my mind. I create a photograph in my mind. And this is my dog. His name is Rocky, and he's awfully cute. But I put him here to share an example of details and why they're so important. I had a wonderful opportunity to interview an 87-year-old woman who was leaving her entire estate. She'd never had children, didn't have any grandchildren. Her nieces and nephews were all doing really well. So she was leaving her entire estate to Best Friends Animal Society. And we had the great privilege to call and interview her for a legacy newsletter and tell her story. And she was wonderful. She had all kinds of stories about cats that she'd rescued and how they didn't get along with her dogs. And it was a lovely conversation. And when we asked her about her pets, this woman, this 87-year-old woman, told us about every pet she'd ever owned. Peppy Jacob, Rags, Blackie, Howie, Hunky, Miss Booties, and Lily. Lily is her current dog, who she says is so smart that sometimes she thinks she's going to take the keys and her purse and go off to the mall and go shopping. You hear that story, and maybe you've even had a dog named Blackie, right? Or maybe your neighbor did. Or the idea of some older woman in her waning years reflecting on all the pets she's ever owned just makes you feel good about humanity. Those are the ways that details make a difference. So, fourth element of a good story is that it has to start before your organization got involved. And that's hard, right? Because you only started when you started. But that's why the interviews become so important, because if you can't tell me what was happening in this person's life and paint a picture of the injustice, the emotional distress, the problem that was going on before you got involved, then I can't see the power of your organization. I can't see that transformation unless you start before I got there. So you have to start here. You have to You have to dig for what was life like before you picked up the phone and called legal aid. And I have a wonderful story as an example of this, and we worked on a project with Mercy Home in Chicago, which is, in the old days, I guess we would call an orphanage, but homes for children who are not able to be adopted or put into foster care. And one particular, and this appeal that they'd asked us to write was for a new project. Someone had donated a building to them, and they were going to turn it into what they were calling second stage housing for the kids who'd already aged out of foster care, but still weren't quite making it enough to be able to afford an apartment, right? And they still needed a little extra layer of help. They didn't have a mom or dad to lean on, right? And this one particular young man who'd come to Mercy Home when he was 14, but his sister had stayed at the foster home because the foster family had decided that having a teenage boy was just too much. They couldn't do it. They would keep only the sister. So he went to Mercy Home, and he desperately missed his sister, and he always hoped that they would be reunited. But he grew up his last 4 or 5 years at Mercy Home. He had got there, he was, 6 grades behind in school. He'd been, their parents had been drug addicts. There's a horrible, horrible story. But here he's now at Mercy Home, and he's going to finish out his high school years there. He graduates, he gets a job, he gets some training in mechanics, he becomes an auto mechanic. He's living in a group house with other people, that's what he can afford. But he really, really wants to bring his sister out of foster care, to be reunited with her. But they're not going to let his sister come live with him in a group house with a bunch of other young men. But when the second chance housing building opened, this man and his sister was one of the first families to move in. And it's a lovely story of siblings reunited. But it only means something if you know what was going on before we started. So very, very important to back up to before you got involved. Fifth element of a great story is that it shows change and transformation. She doesn't look very happy in the first picture. She looks a little distressed. But in the second picture, life is good. She's moving on. Things are good. This is a simplistic view, but this is what we're trying to do, is to show that when legal aid is there to intervene in poor people's lives in very desperate situations, we can move them from despair into stability. And to show change and transformation, you tell stories and you explain how someone's life is better today than it was before. And often they tell the stories for you. And here's an example of a piece we did for AARP Foundation, which is doing a lot of work, especially since the Great Recession, on the unemployment problem, and 50 plus workers are having a lot of them having a very hard time finding jobs. And these were actual letters that they received by email or by mail from members, from people who had been helped by their job service programs, right? And all we did was to take them and compile a few of these and put them in an insert that went in the letter. So we're just reporting back the transformation. And I love this last guy's, the one on the left, which you probably can't read, but I'll tell you. He said, "You helped me. I was feeling like nobody wanted me, that I was washed up, and that I had lost all my confidence, and you helped me realize that I still had something to offer." And his closing line of this letter was, "You have helped this old man get back to where I used to be." Right? And if we were to write about him, we would never call him an old man, right? That wouldn't be polite. But because he said it himself, it's very, very powerful and very real and very authentic. So think about ways that you can show transformation even without having to do a whole lot of work on your own, but just using the stories that people share with you. And the sixth element of a great story is that it creates emotion. Now, granted, you may not want to create quite this much emotion because he's a pretty unhappy little boy, but he's awfully cute, so I decided to use him for our presentation. But again, we've talked about emotion. You have to be willing to go there. You can't shy away. I can't tell you how many times I've had staff say to me, "Well, I didn't want to ask her that because I didn't want to make her cry." I get it. It's hard. Nobody said this is easy, but you have to be willing to go there. And it's okay if she cries, because you know what? Crying is part of healing, right? So if you're interviewing someone who went through a very difficult experience, and by having them tell you about it, some of those feelings come up, it's one step in them healing from that experience. So don't be afraid to go there. Oops, hang on. This thing just moves like crazy. All right, so now we're going to go back to that opening story, and I'm going to just quickly show you how these 6 steps are present in that story that we started with. So why does our work matter? Because we can prevent what happened to Matthew from happening to other teenagers. That's the why. It's not what do we do. We have, we're trying to get laws passed. We're trying to educate parents. We're trying to work with police about buying back guns. None of that. It's about the why. We want to stop this from happening. It's about one person. It's about this mother and her son, her story of her son. It works because it has details. We learned that her son was a wrestling champion, that he played the violin. We can picture him. We heard verbatim the story of the phone call from the police. And we can imagine standing there in our pajamas at 3 a.m. with a call like that on someone we love. And we feel it because of the details. We hear the before story. We find out that he was in school, very involved in school, that he had lots of friends, that he had a loving, happy family. We understand what happened before this incident. We get a sense of change and transformation. Here's a woman who's dedicated her life to bringing more people to this movement. She's getting millions of others involved. And then the emotion of losing a child. Even if you don't have a child, if you're an aunt, if you're a mom, a dad, if you're an aunt, if you're a godparent, you can relate to what this woman went through in losing her son before he'd even finished college. So the emotion was there. So just a good example, use these things when you're doing your interviews. Think about these elements when you are talking to people. It will help your stories be better. Now, I've shared with you a lot of good ideas about how to find your stories, why stories matter, why it's particularly hard for legal aid organizations. Now, I want to talk to you about your own action plan to raise more money with stories. So in your handouts, you have a page that's labeled your action plan. And I'm going to give you 4 steps that I hope you will go back and do for your organization based on this presentation. Number 1, take one of your lawyers to coffee or lunch. Think about who that person is right now and write down their name on your action plan. Next to their name, write August 15th. That's your deadline to take them to lunch. That's 3 weeks. It's manageable. Coffee, whatever. I cannot tell you how much this will pay dividends if you start doing this regularly with some of the best storytellers on your team. Can you do that? Everybody good? All right, number 2. When I spoke to Cindy in Tennessee, she said one of the problems that we have is that we go to the lawyers for stories and they say, well, the communications people were just here yesterday asking me for stories. And then last week, the executive director wanted a story for a speech he was giving. And then the board chair wanted a story because he was having a party at his house with some friends he wanted to talk about. And he says to me, don't you guys ever talk to each other? Does this sound familiar to anyone? We need to do a better job of understanding what all the needs for the stories are within our organization and to create a central repository or a story bank where those stories live so that we can all access them. And then we can also all share them together with one another at staff meetings, in whatever way. And this repository should include the video that you used at your event. It should include the emails that have come in with people telling you their own stories. It should include the interviews you've conducted and the notes from those interviews that you've conducted. Any stories should go in here. And it's a great summer intern project or fall intern project to have somebody help you organize this, right? And to start to think about whether there are some key words that you want to categorize things under. Maybe you want some stories that are focused on domestic violence versus stories focused on whatever, so that when you're doing targeted proposals, you know where to go. I don't know what those categories are, but you do. Sit down, create a team, a task force within your organization of a few people to make this happen. So write down story bank or story repository on your action plan. And then write down September 24th. That's 2 months from today. And you can at least have had a first meeting of your group that's going to be in charge of organizing your story bank in that time period, and start the process of getting something organized. Number 3 on your action plan is to commit to conducting 1 interview every single month. And look at this picture. I mean, there are 31 days on here. And you only have to do an interview 1 of those days. It's not so hard. So just make a commitment to do it. Go into your calendar, block off time, think a couple weeks out about who that you might want to talk to, and schedule it and do it. And do 1 every single month. It will not only give you information and stories to use in your fundraising, but it will also feed your soul and make you happy that you're doing this great work and helping people's lives. It really, really will. It's inspiring. I tell people all the time that I have the best job in the world because I get to go out and talk to people about how their lives have been changed by incredible change-making organizations. And it's absolutely true. It's inspiring. So get out there and talk to people. They're not going to come find you at your desk. And step 4 on your action plan is to share the stories, both internally and externally. People, remember that you have constituents within your own organization as well as outside your organization that need to be reminded of the power of stories, that can benefit from hearing these stories. If they inspire you, then take one of the quotes that you got from a great interview and put it up on a bulletin board or on the door of your office so that other people who walk by say, wow, that really is inspiring. Make it something that you do in staff meetings, as we talked about earlier. Make the sharing of stories, celebrate them. Be excited with your whole team about the great work that you're doing and the lives that you're changing. Because truthfully, you are changing lives in truly amazing and courageous ways. And I want to close my remarks with one final story that Cindy also shared with me. And this is a story of a woman who was helped by Legal Aid of Middle Tennessee. She had 3 children and an abusive husband. Often beat her late at night when he was drunk. Probably not. She thought maybe when the kids didn't hear, but she knew, probably they knew. And then one time when she was pregnant with her 4th, in a particularly violent rage, her husband kicked her in the stomach. And she knew at that moment it was time to get out. She had to do something. So the next day she called Legal Aid. And Legal Aid did what all of your organizations do. They filed an order of protection. They got the woman and her children into a shelter. They got the woman and her children into counseling. They helped her eventually file for divorce. They helped her get back on her feet enough to start a new journey for her kids, for her and her kids. And this woman was a courageous woman, just to have taken the step to leave, but she didn't stop there. She went on to take classes in evenings and weekends, even when she was working full-time and raising 4 kids. I mean, I don't know about you, but I have a hard time just kind of getting to work and back some days, you know? So working full-time, raising 4 kids, and going to school. And she now works as a dental hygienist, has a good job. And she has a dream for her children that is bigger than where she has even gone for herself. That is the courageous work that you make possible every single day. So find your stories, structure your stories, tell your stories, raise more money, and help more people, because you are changing the world. Thank you.